Today I'd like to talk to you about woodland reclamation. Many years ago, this place was so full of bramble and weeds and brush that the true value of it was never really exposed. And after I met with the forestry department, they came here and helped me greatly and told me what trees were invasive and what trees were going to be taking way too many nutrients out of the woodland floor and what to get rid of, what to keep, to raise the canopy, to do slow burning. They gave me all these great tips that I would really encourage anyone with any kind of woodland environment to call the forestry department and have them come out to your land and walk through it with you. It was a valuable resource. And so since I've been able to do that, I've been able to open this property up so much and be able to experience the things that they told me. And they said to me, if you do the work and you get in here and do these things we're telling you to do, you will be amazed at what will come up on this property. And they were absolutely right. Year after year, I see many new things, many new types of flowers, many new types of shrubs, many new types of seed pods, mushrooms, vegetation, many different things that I never knew I had the potential to grow, to enjoy, and to be able to share and sell. And so I think now, looking at this property, there's such a huge potential for the future and for this, even this upcoming year, to plant thousands of new seedlings of different grains and amaranth, celosia, and be able to not only resell those things or dry them and use them for arrangements and kitting, but to be able to share this information with other farmers, because so many farmers look at the land that they have, the open space, and I think that maybe the woods get kind of the bad rap. They're kind of looked at as more maintenance, whereas if you put a little bit of maintenance into them, you can really reap a lot of benefit in your land. So that's, I think, one of the most beautiful parts of woodland reclamation, is that, nothing can control Mother Nature, but this is a kind of a way to help her bring back a magical forest. And that's what my goal was in the beginning of all of this. I said, I want to turn this bramble, prickly rose mess into a magical forest fairy tale. And so that's kind of what I've been after, is creating the scenes and creating the trails and being able to create an entire experience back here that not only is productive financially to be able to pull things out, to be able to sell, but for just the simple enjoyment of it all, so that we can actually use the land, but use it in a different way than you use up by your house. It's an entirely different world back here. It's a whole other world. And I think when you really start to pay attention to that, then you're able to learn that there's so many different types of opportunities back here, from wild onion to wild strawberries, raspberries, mushrooms. There's just such an opportunity to learn about those things, none of which I even knew existed when we bought this property. So I want to take a minute just to talk to you about slow burning and what that can do for your forest floor. When you do slow burning, and you're going to start the fire in one area and allow it to creep through the woodland floor, what happens is that's going to burn off a lot of weed seeds that are laying dormant on the ground or underneath, right directly underneath the ground, and it'll keep a lot of those things from germinating and coming back up. It also helps to clean up the woodland floor and allows the sun to penetrate the soil that's on the ground, to allow a lot of native seeds to be able to penetrate the ground and come up around your woodland area. And that'll bring up a lot of different things. The guy that visited my property from the forestry department said to me, if you clean these woods up and slow burn and get rid of these dead trees, you will be amazed at what you will see come up on this property. And he was absolutely right. After I did that, every year that progresses, we see more and more of a diverse amount of plants and exciting things popping up all around us as the seasons progress. So controlling is very, very important. If you keep it small, if you're unable to have a hose or water near you, the best method that I have used as a fire begins to go is to stomp it out. If it starts to spread too quickly, you can stomp it out. Always do this with someone or multiple people, so that there are multiple people around to help control the spread and watch it. If it's still smoldering, be careful leaving the site, because if it's still smoldering, that means that it could still potentially flare back up and create a fire again. So you want to make sure that the good part is The woodland floor is always cool and moist, so it is easier to get rid of the fires and stop them after they've done the slow burning. So a lot of people are really scared of burning in the woodland, and I think that's because on the news you hear all these things of wildfires catching and going. So there's a couple different tips that you can abide by. And those rules would be: get a wind app on your phone. I have a wind application on my phone that I'm able to check, and I will not burn if the wind is blowing faster than 10 miles an hour. And then also make sure that you check for the next day as well, because sometimes you can burn and then residue and things still may be on the ground smoldering. And if you have a high wind day or a high wind night, then that could lead to a sleepless night. So make sure that you check the wind. And then the other consideration is when you're burning in an environment like my backyard, back in where the creek is and the moist soils, it's different than the high desert areas where the air is so dry. The air is much more humid here, which helps control the fire. Whereas when there's not humidity in the air, it allows the fire to just take off and kind of burn through things that are dry, whereas here in the woodland floor, there's a lot of moisture. Oftentimes in nature, the time that you may have to do something is not the most appropriate time to do it. So safety is always first, and if you use those tips of checking the wind and watching the area and where you're burning and making sure that it's completely out. The other thing to take into consideration is when you're burning and doing a slow burn, it's not like burning a burn pile or a wood pile where the heat gets so intense. You're really just kind of cleaning up the floor and burning off the seeds that are going to germinate and cleaning up the debris that's on the floor to allow the sun to penetrate the soil. There's a huge misconception that burning can be bad for trees, but it's actually quite the opposite. Burning is wonderful to remove the debris off the bottom of the floor to allow nutrients and water to get to your trees. When there's a bunch of different pieces of decayed wood and things like that laying all over the floor, those things absorb the water and leave the trees out. So it can actually help. I mean, the best thing that I use is being able to stomp out a fire. Will put it out pretty quickly. There's a difference between burning in a field where there may be old grasses and things of that nature, opposed to burning on a woodland floor. One thing I always make sure I do is if I'm going to burn in an area, I collect all the sticks off the ground that I can see. Because the last thing you want is something like this that's dry and dead catching fire, and then the heat stays in this and can continue to keep the fire going. When it's just burning leaves and twigs and debris off the floor, it'll clear it out and burn it in a second and it's over. So the slow burning is not a rapid fire intense. It should be exactly that, a slow burn that you kind of just follow and keep it contained section by section. When you're burning in different areas, it's pretty much open. You know, you're burning the debris and you're taking a lot of the garbage off the bottom of the floor, and so some things are going to smolder and burn up. There's not really any wildlife as far as, I've never come into a situation where I've had an animal of any type, be injured or hurt by what I was doing. Now, the one thing I do make sure that I do is if I make a wood pile, so if I'm clearing in the spring and I'm making a big wood pile from just the debris of the trees that I'm cutting down, I make sure that I try to burn that within the same season or within like a month or two after making the pile, because then it can be a habitat. So then you've got birds in there and things of that nature, which I don't want to disrupt that. The other thing I can do is burn in the winter. So if I don't burn in the spring, then I'll save the piles for the winter when there is not anything in, when we have a really cold winter, there's nothing in the twigs and the branches. One of the things that I battled with when I first started working back in the woodland were the vines, the poison ivy vines, the wild grapevines. That was one of the first things that I did, was take a saw and go to every single one of these trees and cut the vines. What happens with those vines is they grow up into the trees, they grow down outside of the branches, and they cover the leaves. So they absorb the sun and the rain and everything that's coming around, and that's why you see these trees that are big, beautiful trees covered in vines, and they're dying. You've got to get rid of those vines to keep the trees healthy. The other consideration is raising the canopy. When you raise the canopy, and that means simply cutting up as high as you possibly can. I like to use a pole saw and I extend it out. I have one that goes up to 14 feet. So as I'm going through the woods and checking for vines, I'm also clearing out any branches that are coming out. Raising the canopy brings better airflow in and also allows for more sunlight to penetrate the floor, which is what you want when you're trying to grow anything. One thing you want to be mindful of is water runoff. So as the water is coming down through the areas of the property to the creek, for flowers, it's really not that big of a deal, but if you're a vegetable farmer, you're going to want to make sure that you're in full sun and that you're monitoring where the water is gathering and puddling in different areas as you clear trees and develop root structures for your vegetable crops. So definitely keep that in mind, and just simply observing your land throughout the year can help you get a firmer grip on where the water is traveling and how it's traveling. There are many different ways that you can bring water features to your property, and specifically to help you with your growing. If you don't have a creek in the backyard, you can again watch the way the water runoff is draining through your property, and you can essentially create ponds where the bulk of your water runoff is coming to be able to collect water and use that for your crops back in the woods. Oftentimes when we're working with Mother Nature, there are things that we want to do versus the things that we can do. So one of the main things is to take a look around and evaluate the sun, the shade, the part sun. For a vegetable farmer, you're going to want to make sure that you have full sun. If you're growing fruits and nuts, you can do some of those things in the woods. So it's all about a balance of doing what works best for the property that you've been blessed with. As I'm making my way through my property every season and checking things out, in the fall when I start to see different seed pods or different grasses that have grown and they start to go to seed, I'm real methodical about my practices as far as taking those seeds when they're ready. So when everything's cracking and dry and brown, I'm taking those seeds and I'm putting them directly onto soil. I'm not just spreading them and having the chance that they might get to the soil. I'm clearing an area, a small area. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. I clear a small area. I take the seed pods from different things. The birds are constantly flying through here, and so the birds are bringing new types of variety of native seeds and different things around, so I'm able to take the seed pods or the grains or whatever it may be and continue to propagate those things through the woodland. As an experiment, I used the burn piles from where I was clearing, and after I burnt, I mixed in about 2 inches of compost in the top layer. And knowing that it had killed all the seeds, the weed seeds that would have been present there, I was able to actually grow without any trouble different types of seeds. So right here you see Rose of Sharon. So this eventually will become this beautiful cluster of purple Rose of Sharon in the middle of the woods. And I had to contend with very few weeds because of using my burn pile. But you have to amend that soil first because with the high levels of ash, the chemicals that are in the soil from the ash, it inhibits the seed growth. So go ahead and mix your compost in there and you will be amazed to see what happens on the top of a burn site. To each farmer their own. There are different things that I do here that another farmer would never propagate those grasses on their land. But I'm always looking for things that hold form and hold structure because I love to make my arrangements and I love to be able to use those things off of my property. So anything that I see that's holding form, sometimes it may even be a type of a thistle or something like that, like those things are valuable to me, whereas to other farmers they may not be as valuable. But I do keep those things under control, and I make sure that I have a set area for different things that may be considered invasive, even though they have things like seed pods that are of great use to me. So for instance, I am constantly an observer of this property, and that is the number one priority with the things that I do. I'm constantly looking and watching to see when is the proper time to pull something. And it's all about experimenting because, for instance, the jelly mushroom that grows on the oak trees is disgusting when it's fresh, but when it's dried, it's a gem. And that's exactly what I want for my dried arrangements. So being able to know when the right time to harvest these things that are not things you would typically harvest, but it's all in the experimentation of all of it, and then paying attention. The polypores take years to develop on the black locust trees. So being able to know when the timing is right or allowing them to grow to get to their full size before you pull them. You can make a tincture from them. You can use them in the arrangements. It's all a matter of timing in nature. And even in my yard, when I'm harvesting flowers, I'm able to harvest at different times to get different results. So for instance, I have a ton of hydrangea. So I'm harvesting a hydrangea that's gonna bloom when it's white, and I'm gonna harvest it when it's white, and then it's gonna turn green, and I'm gonna harvest it when it's green, and then I'm gonna harvest it when it turns multiple colors into mauves and into other shades in the fall. Every single time harvesting at different intervals. But some flowers you can't harvest that early because then they'll wilt and they'll die. So it's all a matter of experimenting and knowing the different ways to be able to dry the flowers to be able to produce the end result of color in the arrangements. So when I first started doing this a few years ago and making arrangements, the one thing I would always post about was, hey, check this beautiful thing out. It's free. I made it for nothing. And people would send me messages and they would say, you know, you made something really beautiful and you should be proud of that, but it wasn't free. You know, how many hours did you spend toiling over these different things, or searching back in the woods, or trying to find ways to get the things up in the trees, or get across the creek to get the things I wanted to harvest and then be able to dry them and preserve them. I mean, there's a real art to preserving these flowers. And, you know, I think, again, going back to just being experimental with the beautiful things that you see on your property, a lot of times these things pass you by. And I know that because people come to my property and they're like, how did you see that? How did you, you know, but you have to open your eyes. And when you're intentional about trying to find things on your property that have resale value, you'd be amazed at the number of things that come to light when you actually start to pay attention to everything around you and you're not just seeing what a normal person would see when you look outside of that, and to look for form. There's a huge investment in the land, the cost of the land, maintaining the land, even just the practices of clearing the trails. I mean, that's something that takes me hours to do, and I have to do it like every other week to be able to even access the things I want to access. You know, so just go and looking into what I'm about to do this year in planting. I mean, I've been working on growing these things that I'm going to put down here for months. I mean, every single day. There is not a plant or a seedling that is gone without my attention at least once a day. You know, whether that be something as just simple as giving it a brush over and talking to it, or actually watering, fertilizing, moving the lights around, adding more lights, adding more trays, adding more, you know, just constant. It's a constant process. And when you think about that, it is true. These things aren't free, you know, and there's a service and there's a price to even just the creativity of being able to put these things together. I thought everybody knew how to do this, that it was no big thing. But now that I've actually had more time on such a platform as Instagram, where thousands of people are able to give me their feedback on things, it makes me realize, wow, it's something. And being able to be in this property and to take advantage of being able to pick and pull all these cool things and then put them together is something people cannot do unless they have this environment. I think one of my goals for this next year is going to be, one of my top priorities is not only getting that area cleared and getting it prepped so that I can go ahead and put these seeds down and they have a real great, well, seeds and a ton of starts, keeping that maintained. And the thing is, a tricky thing is down in the woods, you can't just use the black paper and put it down and have no weeds, because you'll have raccoons come and tear the paper up to get to the worms that are underneath. So it's an entirely different world down here. That is going to have to be very closely monitored to get things started. I think once I can get it started and I can get full stands of amaranths and celosias, I'll let those things go to seed, and then I'll have no trouble keeping them going in the future. Water is going to be somewhat of an issue. Now that I've cleared out some different trees and have taken down a lot of the canopy of the things that were dead and damaged, there's going to be some areas that are not going to be as moist and as prolifically you know, nutritional in areas because of now removing these trees. So I think looking at bringing in some of the water turbine style water pumps is what I'm going to have to really look into and get that going for this next season. But I think trying things, and this is my biggest thing too, I think I don't want to fight with Mother Nature, right? I want to work with it. And so I'm going to this year go with my intuition that tells me, put the seeds down, use this area, you've got good sun, you've got good soil, and put your seedlings down, tend to them, hope that a raccoon doesn't come in the middle of the night and pull them all out, But, you know, if it does, then I'm going to adapt to Mother Nature instead of forcing my way of what I want. And I think if I can do that, it will be extremely, extremely rewarding. So in the winter, back here is a great time to harvest the mushrooms, the jelly fungus that's on the oak trees, the polypores that are on the trees as well. Late winter is kind of the most boring time back here because there's not really much doing. Moving into spring is when you're going to be planting your seeds and experimenting with what you have either dried from the year previous and spreading those things, putting your seedlings down, and still observing because there's really not too much doing. You know, you're prepping the stage, you know, you're getting your actors in line, right? So your spring is when you're getting everybody set up to put on their show in the summer and in the fall. So then passing in through summer, you're tending, you're checking all of, I mean, when I planted this stuff back here last year, just as a test to see, can I do this back here? Can you grow stuff in the woods? You know? So when I did my test and everything took, now I did have trouble with some things being dug up and that's always going to be something I'm going to have to contend with. But when I realized that I can get things to grow back here, that just opened up kind of a whole new world of experimentation. So now I'm going to prep the stage in spring, get everything in the ground. I've got all my seed pods saved from last year. And then summer will come along and I'm going to see what takes and allow it to not get overrun with the weeds and the other things that are back here. I have a lot of wildflowers and things that I've been spreading back here for years. So I think just watching everything progress and allowing it and then knowing when to cut everything. So knowing when to cut your amaranths and your grasses, you know, that's a big deal. The grains and things like that. Millet, you have to be right on that. It can't sit longer. Otherwise the seeds, they start popping out. So you want to cut them right before how you want them to look. So making sure that you're on that. Otherwise I mean, it's still okay, but it's not as beautiful as it could be because it starts to release the seed pods. So I think fall is the time when I'm most active back here because that's when it's just a treasure trove, you know, of things, not only native things that have been here, have come in from birds and whatnot, but being able to look around and start collecting. And I bring a basket back with me and I just forage. And I come through here and I open my eyes and I look for things. I harvest moss from the woodland floor, all different kinds of mosses back here. So I can get different types of moss. I can put them in the food dehydrator, which is the best way I've found to dry them to keep the color perfect. I'm also coming back looking for any of the seed pods, any of the flowers that are ready to go. I'm drying things in silica beads. I'm drying things in a dry, dark closet. I'm drying things in the hot garage. I'm doing a variety of different things to be able to dry these flowers with the best amount of color. And then also processing flowers on top of that. You can, you know, dye hydrangea if you want to change the color. You can do a lot of different things. So I think the fall is when I'm the busiest out here as far as I'm coming back up to the house, schlepping a bunch of turkey tail and schlepping a bunch of stuff that has just popped up in the last week, which is always insane that happens. You know, the woods change so quickly. So it's really, really fun. It's kind of like a treasure hunt back here, you know, like when you really start to look around. So in the fall, my eye is out for anything that's, again, holding form, which is the number one key in all of this. So anything that's going to hold its shape and anything that's going to stay as it is. So you're looking for the seed pods because those seed pods are going to be full of hundreds of seeds that then if you harvest that in the fall, it's very simple. It's the same thing as the vegetable gardening. You know what I mean? But for some reason, because it's in the woods, sometimes it's not connected, but it's all the same thing. You know, if you're a flower farmer, you're looking for when the perfect time is to cut those flowers, to dry them, to use the seed pods, and when they're going to seed. You know, so like if it's a carrot, you know, an ornamental carrot, you're waiting until the seeds form on the carrot, and then you're cutting it, and you're bringing it in, and you're storing it until the spring, and then you're putting it back out in the spring, and you're letting the whole cycle repeat itself. So it's the same thing in the woods. You know, it's the same thing with all the things that are growing back here. It's no different than the ornamentals that are up at the house. And I think when you look at it that way, then you start to see something like maybe one crazy grass that was dropped off by a bird, and you see that one feathery plume that shoots up, and you snatch that grass and you bring it back up to the house, and you have now thousands of seeds that you can use for the next year. So you took from that one grass that was dropped to you, and now you're able to start a whole section of that grass for the next year. You know, and I think that's also really fun too. There are grasses that farmers will look at and be like, oh, that's garbage. Get it out of here. I don't want it. But to someone like me, who's going to be creating with it, it's fantastic. And I mean, I can show you examples of just these beautiful grasses that you would never think would be something that someone would ever say, I don't want that on my property. So I think it's all in, and that's another thing, it's all in the perception of what you see. Someone may look at something and think it's a weed, but I look at it and think, how can I make something with this? And so when you start to change your perception from looking at something in the negative light to how can you profit from this or how can you create with this, it changes everything. Because then that's the one thing that I've noticed. People say to me, how did you think of that? How did you see that? And it was all because my perception is I'm looking for beauty that I can harvest and keep, whether it's up there or down here. And so even with the seed pods, the nuts, using all the acorns, so this is great. This is a great story. I wanted to make a wreath, and I said, I'm going to pull my own acorns. I'm going to make this wreath. I harvested hundreds of acorns. And I said, I'm going to be a steward of this land. I'm going to use this land to create beautiful things. I bring these acorns into my basement, and a few days later, there are a bunch of holes in all the acorns, and I had about 1,000 grubs on the floor, all moving towards the back door. So again, it's just, you know, you can be free to experiment, but then I said, well, other people make these. How are they doing it? And then I researched, you're supposed to bake them. So you always bake your acorns at 200 degrees for 3 hours so that you can eliminate any of the grubs that will chew their way out of it. So the bur oak acorns, I posted about those this past year because I don't know if you've ever seen a bur oak acorn, but it's absolutely gorgeous. And when you snatch them off the tree, they're still green and they're real fuzzy and they're really, really pretty. And when I posted those pictures, so I did a post not only showing the acorns in the green, but then I showed them after you bake them. They turn a beautiful color of brown, like a caramel brown with a lot of different hues. And I had people messaging me saying, how much do you want for those? How much can I buy your acorns for? In California, they don't have them where they are, and they want them for arrangements. I mean, it's craziness, you know? To think that something that I have by the thousands is something that other people look at and they want to purchase from across the country. I think one of the first things I did was rented a bobcat, and I used that bobcat, we called it clearing highways, and we made highways all through the property so that we could access the property. Because if you're going into an area that's completely overgrown, it is so intimidating. So I think if you can get in with the bobcat, create your trails, you know, your magical little wonderland of trails. Maybe you look at an overhead of your property and you're able to start, you know, kind of putting the trails. Like I knew for certain I wanted to go on the property line around the creek and create one big loop. And that was the first thing I did. And then the next year I made more trails that kind of connected in through the loop. And then up on the second tier, going in there. So I think just not being overwhelmed by the whole thing. I think people get so overwhelmed, whether it be throwing a plant in the ground or thinking about reclaiming your woods, that then the thought of it just kind of shuts them down. They can't process it. But if you start simple with that bobcat or have someone come in and do it for you, and say you don't have the money to do it, you rent a bobcat, which is, you know, I mean, you can rent a bobcat to start clearing for $300-400. You know, my tip was always to do it over a holiday weekend. You know, do it over Thanksgiving, do it over something like that. So it's because you're getting the same amount of hours that you're going to pay for, but then you're not rushing to get all the work done in one day, right? Because you got the weekend. So you can say, I'm going to take 3 hours a day, and I'm going to really think this through, and I'm going to do what I need to do. I think if you can rent the bobcat or rent the equipment to be able to clear, and then start with clearing the vines, because that's another huge thing in the woods. People are terrified of poison ivy. So I think if you can get in, get the vines cleaned out so that it's not so It's not so scary on that aspect. And then, you know, you'll find as you clear and you remove a lot of the brush, you'll have less ticks and less things like that that are also pretty scary. And so then you're not scared to come out on your land. You know, a lot of people are real scared to get back in the woods. But I think if you are a steward of your land and you know, my whole thing was when I bought this property, I said, I'm gonna leave this place better than I found it. And I want to maximize the full beauty of this property. And just asking for guidance. You know, I asked for the guidance from above to give me the path of what I'm supposed to be doing. And in just that simple question of asking for guidance, I mean, the signs have come to me, you know? I mean, I'm no different than anybody else. You know, it's just a matter of wanting to do something and making it a priority.